So hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Salvador Munoz, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Outreach at Poster House, which is, of course, the first and only museum in the United States dedicated to the art and history of the poster. I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's program, It Takes a Village, Unsung Women and Their Contributions to Silent Film, with film historian and writer Mary Mallory. This program is presented in conjunction with our current hallway exhibition, Experimental Marriage, Women in Early Hollywood, on view through the generous loan of Dwight Cleveland until October 9th. Tonight's program will explore the often untold history of how women contributed heavily to early Hollywood filmmaking, doing everything from editing to designing, producing to directing. Mary Mallory is the author of 4 books and a blogger on Los Angeles and early film history. She has contributed to the Women Film Pioneers Project, the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, and American History Magazine. She has also lectured at the Niles Essanay Silent Film Museum, Hollywood Heritage Museum, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UCLA, and she currently serves at the Hollywood Heritage Board of Directors. So before we get started, I just wanted to share a few notes on accessibility for this program. Automated closed captioning is available for those who need it, and you can turn it on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. This program will be recorded and made available for all registered attendees after the event. So if you miss a part or want to come back and rewatch it, you'll have the option to do so. If you have any questions during the program, you can drop the questions in the chat or the Q&A box at any time, and I will go ahead and vocalize them for you. Just remember to set your chat to everyone so that we can all see your questions. And then without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mary.
Thank you, Sal. Let me pull up our presentation here. And silent film, it really did take a village to make films and for women helping each other here in early silent film. And this quote really sort of helps set the thing of these women belong to various departments of the moving picture industry, and their work there, it is just as important, just as creative, and sometimes more self-developing than the work of the stars, writers, supervisors, and directors. These silent workers form the real background of the profession. And this quote is from Alice Guy-Blaché. There are lobby cards that she, in the exhibit that she wrote the script for. And this was from a subject series she did called Unknown Women of Filmland, 1923. And women were integral in the film industry. It took women to get all the amount of films made, and they came in at a time in the progressive era when women, immigrants, people of color, and Jewish people were all fighting to have a voice in society, to have increased rights, and to be able to contribute. They came in as the film industry was really developing in those early decades, and as women were fighting suffrage fight to gain the right to vote. So a lot of this all came together to help women shape the industry. They made great contributions, only in a way to be either rewritten or forgotten from history. And we're going to look at some of these forgotten stories. And as I said, women's suffrage came along in 1911, 1912. And in that decade, that was the decade women really took off, writing, directing, producing, doing everything before and behind the screen. As you can see in the cartoon to the left, everything was working together to bring women in. But women would not have had a place in the cinema if it was not for Alice Guy-Blaché, the true mother of cinema. She was in France. She worked for a camera company that was bought out by Leo Gaumont in 1894, and it had a camera patent. She came with him to become his secretary, and in 1896, they started making films. She asked to make films. He said, well, if you can do it after you do your job. Many think she was the first person to come up with the idea of a narrative film. And she managed the studio, was the head of the studio from 1897 to 1906, writing, directing, producing, doing everything. She's the one who set everything in motion for women. 1907, she and her husband, Herbert Guy-Blaché, came to the United States to try to sell Gaumont's sound on film system. Didn't go very well, but in 1910, they start making, actually in 1907, start making sound films in the process in New Jersey. And so doing, she becomes the first woman head of a studio in the United States. At the same time, a young woman by the name of Lois Weber becomes an actress, helping in some making of these films. So she is learning at the footsteps of Alice Guy-Blaché. 1910s, Alice forms Solax and becomes a player in the Motion Picture Trust. Thomas Edison had copyrighted his camera and with the Kodak film, and so members had to be members of the Motion Picture Trust. She is the head of the studio, writing, directing, producing, famous around the country.
Sorry, Mary, can you repeat the name of the studio?
Solax, Solax.
Thank you.
In Fort Lee, New Jersey. And so she's famous around the country as Madame Blaché. And this is at a time when the early film industry, that first decade, was like the theater world. It took everyone. They threw in like one person might be directing, but people were coming up with story ideas, scripts, helping make costumes, sets, props, finding locations. So it was more of a family atmosphere. But the trust is soon going to go away, and that's going to help women. And one of the women in that first decade, who's little known today, but was an important player, is Jean Gontier. She was on the stage before she got into film, and in 1907 joined Calum, Fort Lee, New Jersey. She was attractive and a go-getter, and she became known as the Calum girl early on. They used her in advertising, but also she was writing, not just performing in the films, but writing. And she was one of the first action stars, created a series around a woman who was a Confederate spy. She did all of her own stunts and was writing the scripts. And we think she was also directing some of the films. In early 1900s, 1910, 1912, the company goes to Ireland and makes films that they called the O'Callums because they were set in Ireland. And then they went to Egypt. They were the first company to go on location in the Holy Land in Egypt and shot a feature about Jesus and the Holy Life from the manger to the cross. She's actually the first woman who helps bring copyright to motion pictures when she writes the script in 1907. So she had a major part to play. At 1912, as I mentioned, the trust goes out of business. And at that point, the industry just literally explodes. It had started out as an industry appealing to immigrants. The ruling elite looked down upon it, which helped women and people of color and immigrants become so active early on in the film industry. But it starts exploding, and they need more and more women to help get the output that they need to create the product. Many women will also go on and form their own companies at this time, wanting to be in control. And the person in this period who is the most important woman is Lois Weber, who can be called an American auteur. She did learn with Alice and started with Alice. She was a stage actress as well after she left evangelism. So she was one always promoting social causes. Worked there with Alice and then joined Universal Film Manufacturing Company. And she and her husband, Philip Smalley, they had met and married while they were on the stage. They are co-producers. It's during a point called the Uplift Movement. They're bringing women into the industry, showing that it's an upstanding industry that women and families can go to. So they are listed as co-directors. She's producing, directing, writing, and starring in their films. And by 1913, Suspense, she's listed solely as director. And she's showing that she's a master of technique as well as story, and showing that women have truly a place in motion pictures. In the mid-teens, she is one of the top 3 directors in the United States, along with Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith. While they're making epics and melodramas, she's making social issue films, focusing on things like birth control, abortion, wage inequality, poverty. She is reaching out, and people care about these issues. They're very popular at the time. She is so successful that Universal allows her to establish her own studio on Santa Monica Boulevard in 1918. The first woman in what would be considered the growing film industry to have her own major studio. She's making major films. Women are really becoming in their own in the film industry at this point. They're taking over all kinds of positions from, not only writing and cutting, producing and directing. There are multiple women. Universal alone has 11 women directors at this point. They are appealing to women. That is the growing and the big audience for films. And they don't just want to see melodramas. They want to see action, like with the Jean Gaultier. Here, it's the suffrage movement. They're fighting for the right to vote. They even started the suffrage organizations making their own films in 1911, 1912, trying to help with the suffrage movement. So they want to see women active in taking control, like the serial queens. And as the 20s are coming along, it's becoming an important part of women, of having power and influence in the film industry. And there are many women behind the screens, and most of them, the ones that end up in more positions of power, come there because important men and women filmmakers admire their work and help them along. One such person is Elsa Lopez. Before Dwight's exhibit, I had not even heard of this person, and started investigating her. We have found a lot, but we still can find more on her. She was born in 1887 in Argentina. Supposedly her great-grandfather was the head of a prime minister in a country in Central America. 1910, she and her family come to Portland, Oregon. And there she meets Justin O'Connor and they get married. And in 1914, they move to Hollywood. He's a news writer and she's a journalist and an interpreter. We don't know how, but somehow between then and 1916, she meets D.W. Griffith. And as you see the clip on the right-hand side, he hires her as Triangle's research director. That title, research director, had not really been used before. So it could have been created for her. There were men doing the thing, but she is an important player because Triangle and D.W. Griffith, of course, is one of the most important filmmakers. She's researching costumes, props, history, sets, everything so he can be authentic. Well, in 1919, Joseph Skank, who is managing the Talmadge Film Corporation, Constance and Norma Talmadge, he hires her away for the Norma Talmadge Picture Corporation to do the same job because Norma really did period pictures and they wanted to be authentic and as precise as possible. And Elsa did an interview with El Paso paper, and she said that her work is pioneering, that all women have something in them which longs to blaze trails. So there were many women during this period blazing trails. We don't know how, once again, something else we have to learn, but in 1922, she starts becoming an art director. Don't know if she was ambitious enough to go to someone and say, I know art from all the research I'm doing, or someone approaches her. She works on Modern Marriage with Francis X. Bushman, which is more of a period, contemporary for the time. But as you see on the left, she does, and that's more contemporary, but she also did things set in like England in the 1600s, regal periods. She did 5 films, but then mid-20s, she just disappears out of newspapers and trades. I find in 1940, she is divorced O'Connor and is living with a new husband in New Jersey. And in later life, she lived all over the country, but dies in El Paso. So once again, of women, we know something of it, we need to find more on to give them more of a voice in what they did. But she is like a lot of the women of the period, which is very interesting. They use their maiden names. They did not take their husband's names. And this is at a time when you were like Mrs. George Smith. So to go by your maiden name in the paper, and she never mentioned her husband in the trades or the newspapers. Well, another woman little known is Saida Cowan. Some of lobby cards in the exhibit show films that she helped write. She is possibly one of the first Jewish American people involved in the motion picture industry. She was born in Boston in 1882. Her family was somewhat well-to-do. She was well-educated, and in 1905 went to France to study music. She had a couple of, I guess, bad marriages, and but in 1905 starts writing poetry and then one-act plays. And once again, like most of these women, she is a progressive. She's writing about women in their career, birth control, contraception. In 1919, Universal hires her to write her first film script. And later that year, she is ambitious enough. She goes to Cecil B. DeMille and says, I want to apprentice under you. I want to watch you and see, because you're so great with story, to learn that filmmaking process. And in 1920, then she comes up with the story, as you see on the left, Why Change Your Wife, with Gloria Swanson. She would write multiple films for him. Most of her films deal with women as dealing with frustrations, both as family and as a marriage, and then also with trying to balance marriage and work. She wrote for major women stars in the 20s, Norma Shearer, there at Paramount, people like Betty Compson, Marguerite Clark. On the right, Belle Bennett, as you see this film, she's a gambler. And in the mid-20s, she begins writing with the man. The interesting thing is she's the one who's focusing on story, and he's developing characters, which a lot of times it's reversed when there's a man and woman writing team. Well, in 1926, his career starts taking off. And sadly, like a lot of the women, her career starts going downhill. She does write a couple of scripts for minor companies in the early 30s, but has to go back to playwriting and novel writing. So she did write Smoldering Fires for Pauline Frederick in 1925, which is probably one of her most important pictures. And a person who is somewhat known, but not as well known as she should be, because people like Adrian and Howard Greer and others in the 20s take away all that she accomplished. But Clare West was an important costume designer, the first person credited with costume designing. She was born Claire Bell Smith, works millinery and in dressmaking, and ends up going to Paris to study fashion and becomes an artist doing the drawings for fashion. Once again, we don't really know how she got into the motion picture industry, but she starts working for D.W. Griffith. You see connection here. So many of these women that had important positions are working for important players. She works on Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. And supposedly Intolerance is the first film where leads were in period costume and multiple, since it had 4 different stories over the time and multiple huge cast costumes. Well, famous players Lasky decided she's the perfect person to design for Cecil B. DeMille. And so in 1918, they bring her over to become DeMille's costume designer. And she is going to help make Hollywood become a fashion leader, to people to aspire to the dresses they do for contemporary movies, but also as fantasy. And as you can see from these costume designs here on the left, it was the very famous octopus gown. That is B.B. Daniels and the Affairs of Anatole, a DeMille movie. The other two costumes, once again, are for DeMille pictures. And in the Affairs of Anatole, which is one of the ones in the exhibit, she does 25 fur costumes, which in this day and age, that might be a problem, but she does a variety of costumes. So once again, then gets stolen in a way to go work for the Norma Talmadge Film Corporation, doing costumes for Norma. She does costumes for some other people, but by 1930, her film career is basically over. There's so much more to learn about how these women come into the industry, but then also how, in a way, they go away. Well, a woman who is important in doing story and script development in the 20s that is mostly forgotten. Most people know Frances Marion, but very few people know Marion Fairfax. And she was an important playwright and screenwriter. She starts in theater, 1899, as an actress, where she meets and marries the actor Tully Marshall, and they would be married for over 40 years. They act on Broadway, and in 1904, she begins writing for the Broadway stage. 1904 to 1915, as many plays there. Progressive issues, once again. She's writing on things like race relations, addiction, and that would carry on over into the screen. 1915-16, Cecil's brother, William DeMille, discovers her and brings her over into the film industry. And she writes her first scripts for William, who's very literate in the films that he does, and also works with Marshall Nealon, who had been a former actor. She writes scripts for Mary Pickford, Jack Pickford, and people like Norma Talmadge once again. And by 1922 is important enough. She's not only writing scripts, but for the company she's working for, she's advising them on other people's scripts, editing them, looking at films and helping shape them to make the stories even stronger. 1922, she forms Marion Fairfax Productions, where she's the head, and she directs a film, A Lion Lips, in 1922. And the only film her company makes, a variety of issues as the teen industry at the time, and that forces the end of that. But her writing is still strong. Just before she forms the company, she adapts Sherlock Holmes for John Barrymore. And after the company is dissolved, she starts working for First National, one of the major players in the mid-20s. She writes one of the first major sci-fi scripts, The Lost World, with the dinosaurs in London. So she could write anything. Yes? Oh. Sal?
Yeah.
Oh, I saw you raise your hand.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just resting my chin.
Okay, thank you. She was writing for everybody. And in 1923, there's a note on a script at First National saying, Fairfax is always a winner. Don't ever let her get away. Part of the problem here in the mid-20s that she starts doing less and less is that she has health issues. No one knows for sure exactly what those were, but she has to take time away from the screen during these years off and on. And by 1926, her film career is over. And she doesn't go back to screenwriting. So once again, an important player that gets overshadowed by others, even though she's written major scripts that are, and for films that are well known today. Well, in the late teens, into the 20s, as I mentioned, that is the period women really take off. Once the trust dissolves, studios start developing, and women are becoming the most popular audience. Audiences are exploding. And the company almost cannot create enough product to get out to film theaters. So that's when women really go into multiple positions in the industry and become, that's Universal, as I mentioned, 11 directors. There are more than 43 women that direct films prior to 1922. Paramount is another studio that has major women, mostly writing, cutting, and costume design. They have multiple women costume designers. Alice Guy-Blaché would write that writing was the easiest way in for women, because you could do everything from writing titles to editing continuities for films, the continuity scripts that they used in making the films. And so many women got their start there before they moved into cutting. There were tons of women that were cutters. There were few editors, but many women were cutters, even up until 20 years ago. If you look on the screen, men would be credited as editors, but women were credited as the negative cutters. They were considered more detail-oriented and precise. But the women are just all over the screen. It helps that the suffrage movement is really moving ahead. And of course, in 1919, the 19th Amendment comes along, and women now have the right to vote. Women are, becoming more involved in work. And that is helping, like with the action films. They want to see women that are dynamic and active. And stories start getting written. Here's the thing, 50 odd jobs for invisible things of the screen. And it's women that they're promoting, women in all different types of positions. And women are apprenticing with other women. Women are trying to help others. They're teaching women, apprenticing them so they can go on and carry on in that field and help bring more women into the field. It took a village of women to help support and keep the thing going with women. And as I mentioned, as you saw from that, stories start getting written both in the trades and newspapers, promoting women and positions, not just writer or like continuity, but musician on set, the first baby studio teacher, screenwriter, and this is a first woman location manager, that I have been able to discover, and she's literally unknown, very little. I have found very little on her. This is from a story called Unknown People in the Movie World from 1922. Talks about field secretary, which would be like a script girl, continuity person, location finder, etc., are all necessary to success of pictures. Well, Ruth Ullman is the location manager for the Talmadge Film Corporation, and Constance would write about her as well. Little is known. I literally cannot find, except for the few stories I have found in newspapers, anything in Legend or newspapers about her, save what Constance Talmadge writes, in that Ruth came on to do special publicity for the Talmadge Company, working under Beulah Livingstone, who was one of the top publicity people in the silent film industry, and a woman, once working for a female company. Ruth somehow then goes into location management. And as they all say, it's predominated by men. Very few women are location managers. They have to go out and negotiate with estate owners, store managers, whatever, come up, negotiate deals if that requires money or whatever to film on locations. They all, Constance says, Ruth has that special charm where she can get people to agree to things that they might not want to do. So in the early to mid 20s, she's doing location work for the Talmadges. That after that, I still don't know. I'm trying to find out more of Ruth, but this is a person to find out more about, someone who's branching out into fields that literally for decades would be predominated by men. A second one that people have not really heard of before is Lillian Greenberger. She did a variety of things. It seems like she was well educated in business and finance. which definitely most women at that time would not have been educated in. And she did a variety of jobs. She obviously was ambitious and talented. She started out in 1916. She is, which I'm not exactly sure what it means, but she was the Eastern representative for the LKO Comedy Company. So I'm not sure if she's scouting talent for them or if she's helping promote the company to Eastern exhibitors to get them to show the product in the theaters. But by 1918, she becomes Lois Weber's studio and business manager. And I have not found any other women at this time that were business managers for studios. So she's managing the finances, keeping everything going for the finances of this company. And after a few years, though, she decides to move on. Lois at this period was not making as many films. So Lillian, I guess, looked for other challenges. And she moves to Universal, where she becomes head of casting. And so, yes, in the teens and 20s, writing and cutting, women predominated, but they predominate in casting directors by the late teens as well. In the mid-teens, if you look at the listings for studios in their department heads, it's like the Star, D.W. Griffith's company, he's the casting director. Marshall Nealon, he's the casting director. But by the late teens, so much product is being created, the directors, artistic directors can't do that anymore. And it's women. So from like Universal with Lillian to Roach Comedy Studio, women are predominating. So they are the ones that are making the stars. They're finding the unknowns who are going to become the big stars. They're casting those big pictures. If it's important enough director, they might have a say to turn someone down. But it's these women that are casting the great films that we remember from the 20s. And if you see the photo on the lower left, she's the woman standing in the middle, sort of with her hands clasped, and she's not wearing a hat, with sort of blonde hair. This is the only photo I found of her so far.
Mary, sorry,
yes.
Mary. Do we know who wrote the article on the right? Why Let Her Rest?
It is from the Exhibitor Herald magazine. It is not credited. This is totally the whole article. It was, one of their reporters. And as I mentioned, so she is head of casting. Well, she must have been talented enough that Irving Thalberg hires her as his executive assistant in 1921. Not his secretary, but she is the one who would be like the assistants to like Jack Warner and the studio heads in the 30s and 40s, where they're the ones dealing with all the department heads, reporting that to like Thalberg or Jack Warner, reporting back on what he wants them to do and making sure that they follow through on what those people want. So obviously Thalberg thought she was very talented, but by 1922, we don't know the story, but she is let go and Julius Bernstein becomes executive assistant to Thalberg. And at that point, she must have had a problem finding jobs. This was not really until 1924, but as you notice, it's like, why let her rest? Many producers are aware of the sterling bright intellect and business acumen of Lillian Greenberger, especially her knowledge of vital statistics. Here she is resting when she should be placed at the head of a department in which her talents could be utilized to great advantage at the producing company or unit. I mean, so here's a woman who could be like what they would be called like a producer over a unit at the studios of the 20s and 30s. She could handle the business aspects as well as the administrative things of like casting and all that. But the industry is leaving these women behind. In the late 20s, and she's married, but she's going by her maiden name. She and her husband end up in New York. She goes in with some people a couple of times. They incorporate companies to try to make films from scripts, but nothing comes of those. And so unfortunately, by 31, I don't find her anymore in newspapers. So this is a woman who knows the business aspects and could have been the female Irving Thalberg, but unfortunately was not given that opportunity. But as I mentioned, so there are all these stories appearing in newspapers and in the trades in the late teens and in the early 20s promoting women. Alice Guy-Blaché, the writer, does a series of 6 stories for Story World magazine called Unknown Women of Filmland, which she talks about positions. She starts out obviously with writers, since that's her background, but other positions on one woman, for each story and saying what they do. And that clip, that quote at the beginning is saying there's so many women contributing so much and films would not be what they are without these women. Another person doing that is Constance Talmadge. She and Norma here are hiring women into positions of power. And they're also, Constance is trying to promote them to the world. She had a syndicated column in newspapers in 1922 and 23, and she wrote a series called Opportunities for Women in Motion Pictures. And each story was about a different woman and a different position. That's where the Ruth Ullman story came from. She also wrote about a teacher, the musician on the set, which you don't often hear about those kind of things. Editor, writer. So she is trying to promote women and basically saying, here these women are so well qualified, give them more to do, and women come and work in Hollywood. These women can do it, you can too. The story on the left is from Picture Play magazine. This is it's a trade for the business. And this is just promoting 4 women at Universal. Behind the films, women's part in filmmaking. They're doing everything from costumes, and the woman on the top left is the script clerk. Woman the top right, costumes. Viola Lawrence at the bottom is top editor. She is an editor there and will go on to become even more important in the entertainment industry later on. The person I'm going to talk about now is the woman in the lower left, the projectionist. There is little to nothing on women as projectionists in the silent film industry, either in film theaters, now maybe in the little local theaters, but in places like New York or LA, the big professional headquarters and the main centers of film production, you do not hear of women as film projectionists in theaters or at studios. The first women projectionist I come across is, and now I forget her name. She was an actress. She actually started out as a secretary to Charlie Chaplin. And the LA Times 1917 shows her, and so do the trades. She passes, there's I guess a union for projectionists at that time, passes the test and becomes the first licensed woman film projectionist in Los Angeles. Many men are going off to war at this time, so they need women. But and that could be the reason. Jean Spencer, who's the woman on the lower left in that photo, is a projectionist at Universal. But so she is one of the first to do that. So there she is, Jean Spencer. I don't know, I have not been able to find out exactly how she got into the entertainment industry. But she becomes the studio projectionist at Universal. But she is obviously a go-getter and a promoter, and obviously very talented. In the trades in 20 and 21, you find that she's written stories and that Universal has made films from those stories. She serves as the continuity or script person for Foolish Wives with Von Stroheim. She becomes a cutter there at Universal and working in cutting, and she will go on to become a full-fledged editor. In the mid to late 20s, she joins Inspiration Pictures, which was Edwin Caruso's company that he formed particularly to make films with Dolores Del Rio. So like Ramona, 1928, Evangeline, Resurrection. She is the editor. She's the only person credited on screen as editor for these films. So she becomes a full-fledged editor. Well, by the early 30s, she's now sadly, because they go out of business, working like in B pictures for a few studios, and then goes to like the minor majors or the poverty row things. And by the mid 30s, she goes back and is now writing scripts for studios like Republic. And I find my last story about her in 1941. So she was a woman who was able to keep going, reinventing herself, or showing that she was talented and could do whatever. So she moved ahead. And though she's little known, Viola Mallory Lawrence is considered possibly the first woman editor, first woman to be credited as editor. She got started in the business as early as the age of 12. She lived in New York and began working for Vitagraph. And at 12, she supposedly held the title cards while the department filmed them to add to the films for the title sequences. She must have been either really interested in behind the scenes thing or recruited by Vitagraph's head editor, Frank Lawrence, and she starts cutting. And in 1912, she is credited as editor on one of Vitagraph's 3 reel films. So right now, that is the earliest credit we found as a woman as an editor.
Mary, it seems you share a name with this person. Is there any relation?
Excuse me, the what?
It seems you share a name with this person. Is there any relation?
Oh yeah. Well, I have not been able to figure that out yet. I'm hoping so. I don't know much family on the East Coast, so I have to do the genealogy. But once I discovered that name, obviously there was a reason I became interested in her. But yeah, so Viola, she was talented, but there might have been a little bit of nepotism as well at Vitagraph. Frank is hired by Universal in 1917 to become their head editor. And he brings Viola along to assist in the department. And actually she works on Blind Husbands with him. Well, in 1918, they get married. So there might have been a connection with the two of them earlier on, we don't know. She will start going by Viola Lawrence by the early 20s, but she works on major films. But to prevent any people saying there's nepotism, once they get married, she goes to work for the Alan Holabar Productions. His wife, Dorothy Phillips, is one of Universal's major stars. So she edits their films. She also does The Virgin of Istanbul, which is a Todd Browning film. So she is editing for major directors' things. When Gloria Swanson does her independent films in the late 20s, Viola is the editor for those, including Queen Kelly. So I don't know if von Stroheim requested her again and liked working with her. She obviously had to have been tough to get around with some of the filmmakers she worked with, not known as the most easygoing people in the world. She ends up in the late 20s, becomes head of Columbia's editing department. So she is a woman in charge of Columbia. She is, and when she was at Universal, Blanche Sewell, an editor who goes on to work at MGM, apprentices under her. As I mentioned, so many of these women would train other women to continue in the field and help them along in their careers and advancing them or trying to bring more women in. She is a top person. She works on, let's see, Man's Castle with Spencer Tracy and Hotel's Talking, Edward G. Robinson. Craig's wife, the photo on the right, she's on the left, and Dorothy Arzner is on the far right. Dorothy Arzner started as a secretary, then moved up to cutter, then editing, and finally as a director. So she's working finally with a woman here. It's a very woman's oriented picture. Rosalind Russell is the star, and she's there in the center. But Viola would go on to work with directors like Howard Hawks with Only Angels Have Wings, Orson Welles on The Lady from Shanghai, and worked on virtually all Humphrey Bogart Santana productions at Columbia, including In a Lonely Place. She's the editor on that with Nicholas Ray. So she obviously had a strong visual sense, but obviously a strong sense of to be able to stand up to filmmakers like these. She would get nominated for 2 Oscars and work all the way until she retired in the 1960s. So as I mentioned, in the mid-teens, it was people all worked together, and women are in control. They were producing, directing, and as Ruth Clifford, actress, writer, director, wrote, here's a quote from her: "When the women directed the films, the other directors, the men were very cooperative, and the actors didn't resent it at all that a woman was directing. They took direction just the same as if it was a man directing. Everyone cooperated." So at this point, it seems like women, are coming into their own. Their positions of power, their Universal loan with 11 directors. But in the late teens, early 20s, major things start happening, not only in the industry, but in the country, that are going to affect a lot of things. World War I comes along, that helps women because men go off to war. So women fill a lot of positions they never would have had the opportunity in the past. But then when those men come back, they want their positions back. The Spanish flu epidemic hits in 1918-19, like our pandemic of the past 2 years. And that affects studios in multiple ways. Young people, men and women, are dying. And so talented people are dying that could have contributed a lot more. So it's a sad period. There's a recession in 1921. The economy does well, but then after the war, and then goes into recession. Well, studios start laying off men and women or do wage freezes. And this starts in a way becoming the problem for the women. Major stars, we've had Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin break away and form United Artists. But there's other stars and women too, Corinne Griffith and others, have their own production companies. They're making profit participation, have rights to choose directors, writers, co-stars. Well, studios don't want to share profits, as you can imagine, and they want to be in control. So they start figuring out, like, if we take over theaters, it's going to be hard for some of them if they want to try to release on their own. They start forcing out the stars, and also they kill off states' rights. Many independent companies where women like Nell Shipman or others released through, where they went to a person in a variety of states and they would get the rights to distribute the films. They form their own distribution companies, divisions. And now if you're going to distribute a film, you basically have to go through a studio. So overnight, the business is changing. They buy up, start the major theaters in the major cities. The film palaces, most of the major film palaces that we know of, are actually end up owned by studios. So they will guarantee their product is played in those theaters. So to vertically integrate and become the factories as we know them, they need Wall Street money. And that means massive influx of money. Well, the financiers of Wall Street, obviously a very masculine field. And that starts, they want to see more men. It's a good business is like us. It's men who know what to do and in control. But other forces are at play, which are going to start forcing women out of the field. The mid-20s, like in 1925, editors decide to form their own club. And they say, we're against unions, but we want to do a club where we can, talk about editing, work together, have fun together. Frank Lawrence is president, but there's no mention of Viola as a member. So men are starting to figure out a way of, getting women slowly out of the field. And by the late 20s, it's sort of the death knell in that unions and below the line talent Those are the first unions to start forming, and many of those are through Yahtzee, masculine dominated fields and things. And so they come up with things that basically force the women out of the field. So by the mid to late 20s, women are disappear from the industry. But what is the most sad thing, in a way, is there's journalists, both for the trades and newspapers. They've been reporting on the film industry for 10 or 15 years. They know what these women have accomplished. They know who these women are, but they start writing them out of history, or they start denigrating their work. And the poor women must have taken that to heart, because even decades later, when women like Neil Shipman and Jean Gaultier write their autobiographies, they denigrate their own work. They do not give themselves credit for everything they accomplished. So it's like the final thing of getting rewritten and written out of history. There are so many women, and as you see here, here's the thing of independence of 1923, of bringing this up. If we don't change, that we're going to be forced out, which they were. Women are independence, basically go out of business. We had the few Poverty Row studios left, which forces out women that were mostly in independent production. Women are forced out of the studios because of all these forces along. And they're in very few fields. The writing and in editing are the two big fields where women stay, as they had from the mid-teens. But virtually every other field, they are forced out. The 20s, late teens, early 20s, there's more women in more positions and in positions of power than there even are in the film industry today. But we have much still to learn, thanks to feminist academics and scholars in the 1980s. They started investigating these women, bringing them to the forefront. We keep discovering more. We keep building, all of us building on what others know, finding more people, advancing their names. And we need to go forward and giving these women a voice, making them known, and showing that the film industry as we know it wouldn't be along if it wasn't for these women. So I thank you, and I thank Poster House for letting me talk. Here's some of my my references and credits for a lot of the information. And I will say, if you're looking for a lot of information on women from around the world in silent film in various positions, Women Film Pioneers Project is a great place to start. There's bios on women, and there's essays. So that's a great place to start. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was fantastic. I know I certainly learned a lot. We do have a couple of questions that
Please, yes.
Come back to. It sounds like many of these early studio women had the supportive studio heads at the time. Do we know anything about why these men were supportive of the women directors, writers, producers? Were they generally considered to be progressive, or were they motivated by things like money? It just sort of seems like we took a step backwards sort of immediately after this period, and I'd love to know sort of what the shift is. Sorry.
Yeah, it was sort of a combination of both. There were people like DeMille. DeMille liked strong, independent women. If you look, he had Clare West, costume designer, and Bouch's his woman editor from 1918 to the end of his career. His executive assistant, she did location finding as well as managing his finances. Jeannie McPherson, associate producer. I mean, he liked smart women. Many of the women liked smart women, worked well with them. And a lot of them were just looking for whoever who was creative and artistic. Now, a lot of the studio heads, on the other hand, were probably looking at that bottom line. And if you're turning out product that is doing well at the box office, yes, we're going to have you there. So if like you're casting people into films that are then succeeding at the box office, well, that looks good for you. Scripts, if you're writing like Smoldering Fires or Lost World, you're big hits at the box office, that's great. But it's like when the big money starts coming in and everything starts changing, that at that point. And some men, especially in the lower positions, there could be men that were resentful in lower positions that feeling like, well, I should have gotten that position rather than a woman. And as things were changing, they found a way to force them out.
Thank you. And sort of building off that on the flip side of this, that question, how did social conservatives view women filmmakers? Was there any sort of pushback regarding the films and the way that gender roles were developed in the industry?
Yes, like as I mentioned in 1911, 12, the suffrage organizations start making their own films. And social conservatives push back against those, but like, why do women need suffrage? Why are you doing this? And then it's now censorship boards were big around the country. If they thought, things were, oh, that's too outrageous. You're showing too much of things were censored nationwide, citywide, statewide. And they were against, some of the social conservatives were against strong women of, doing more than they should, and that some of them, obviously, you should be married and have a family. Many of these women, some did have children, but some were married but never had children. Their focus was their career. So social conservatives would not have been happy about that as either, that type of thing. And even though more women were starting to work at that period, social conservatives still thought that a woman's place was at home with her children.
Yeah, and then sort of a different direction, but this has come up by a few different folks. And in your research, have you uncovered any specifics about pay differentials between men and women during this era when women were thriving in the film industry?
I haven't been able to find too many pay records. I did come across one thing that claimed that supposedly Lois Weber made more salary-wise than DeMille or Griffith, but they owned profit participation in their pictures because DeMille was one of the owners of Paramount. So he was getting extra money that way. And of course, Griffith in that way too. Some of the others, it seems like they were making, at least starting out wise, were making about the same. But as time went on, that could be a different, we don't have access to a lot of those pay records. We know more about late teens and 20s because there are papers and archives, but particularly that first decade and even to the mid part of the teens, there's not a lot of paperwork via correspondence from studios or people's papers, to know what was happening. And the trades don't always go into detail on those areas.
Yeah, I'd imagine it's hard to get specific, but I think we could make general assumptions. And then lastly, we had a question about when we switched from like silent movies to to the talkies. Were only women pushed out of the industry, or were many studio employees sort of pushed out as well?
Well, I mean, over time, we see various fields go away. I mean, one of the things I like to point out is look at, theaters. The big theaters in the major cities had full orchestras accompanying. Well, sound comes in, those theaters are all gone. But luckily then, like studios established orchestras in those early days to record the music, but probably not as much if there were, multiple orchestras at theaters. There might not have been enough for all the people. Projectionists start out, they're unionized, but that is broken. And they get away from having as many union projectionists at places. So there always is, especially if they're looking at cost cutting, forcing people out. But in the 20s, it was more the women. I mean, because you see, as I mentioned, all these directors that the next woman to direct, they make Dorothy Arzner sound like, wow, she is like this unicorn. She's directing in the late 20s, early 30s, as if there were like no other women. And there had been plenty of women. And then Ida Lupino is not to the next director. I mean, it's like literally women were kept from certain fields. except like editing and writing, though, and cutting. Those were the fields that women seemed to be able more to maintain, or costuming, maybe not as the main designers. There were a few women that were costume designers, but most of those were men. But the women were working in the costume departments, making the costumes.
Yeah. Well, Mary, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. It was incredibly informative. I know that I really learned a lot. And I wanted to thank Dwight Cleveland again for connecting us and making this program possible, and for the generous loan of this exhibition. And I wanted to remind you all that Experimental Marriage, Women in Early Hollywood, is on view through October 9th at Poster House. So you have a little less than a month to come and see it before it comes down. So make sure to come and check us out if you haven't already. And thank you again for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
All right.